Alright, so we're revisiting Finsider Ignis as well. So in version 0.6.4, it got a roughly 30% DPS loss to trigger happy. So with all the 3 skills it's using, depending on what weakness the boss has and stuff like that, it's around 5 to 15% total DPS loss with all 3 attacks. Now this comes a little bit as well from the changes made. It's not only like a DPS loss, it also moved a lot of the damage to that last bullet. So in those cases where Finsider fires like 4 or 5 bullets and then gets staggered or stunned or whatever, it's actually quite a heavy DPS loss compared to the old one. So here are the builds I suggest against Bellanoir Libero. We're starting out with 2 Libero raids just to compare the Hydro Slicer and the Flame Funnel. So Flame Funnel is very strong against Libero. She has a very weird hitbox where Holy Burst and stuff doesn't do a lot of damage to her. But the downside is the counter synergy. When a pal gets soaked, fire skills deal half damage. I did a quick comparison. Just one fight against Libero with the classic Trigger Happy, Hydro Slicer, or Beam Slicer rather, and Flame Funnel, and then also one with replacing Flame Funnel with Hydro Slicer, just to see. They all are all running Lunker, so there's a bit of a DPS bonus to Hydro Slicer, also a big damage bonus to Flying Pass, but you can see that the time there was almost exactly the same, only 2 seconds difference, so just pick the build you want, maybe just Hydro Slicer if you plan on doing more raids. So against Ryu, Trigger Happy, Holy Burst, Hydro Slicer. If you were using Hydro Slicer in the previous fight, you don't have to change skill. Which is, if you care about that, you might as well keep Hydro Slicer. 2 second difference, not big enough to really matter there at all. So against Ryu, Trigger Happy is just extremely strong against Ryu. Super effective water attack that is the highest DPS skill still in the game. Except for maybe Holy Burst against these super big targets. It's still a good skill. Ryu doesn't do the same thing where he kind of staggers pals the same way that maybe Libero with Nightmare Bloom or something does. But he does have this sort of stun in phase 2 with electric skills. Luckily, Finsider Ignis, pretty small pal, so stuff like All Range Thunder might just go right by it. Thunder, Rain, those big area of effect skills tend to not stun the whole pack the same way it would do maybe like an Neptilius army or something like that. You can see they do all get electrified there, that stops one attack. So when you're using something like Orsurk, they just keep going there, no stun. So it's a little bit of the downside versus something like Ryu, is that stun effect. So you can see using Meteor Rain here, this is the skill that can also stun them out of Trigger Happy, so they don't fire that last bullet. Can hurt quite a bit as well, but overall in this fight, the loss from Trigger Happy might not be as bad as it might seem. So Hydro Slicer and Trigger Happy also just doing 66% damage in the last phase, but it seems like around a 20-second slower fight. I didn't have that many fights to compare with before the nerf, but roughly 20 seconds slower compared to their old fight, and just 30 seconds slower than a Neptilius army, because that's one that I did have to compare with. So the nerf does hurt them compared to Neptilius, which is probably the main contender, just due to this Palpod change here. So Palpods are back, and they work a little bit differently in this patch now. We're running Trigger Happy, Holy Burst, Hydro Slicer, and then 6 Meteor Rains instead of Hydro Slicers on 6 of the Finsider Ignises. So what has happened with the Palpods now is that Rescue Pals are back, but there's a bigger punishment for burning, because being a burning pal or being in a burning bed will stop the healing, or might just stun lock the pal in the bed, going in and out of the bed forever. So the new Rescue Pals I'm using now are these 2 Phalaris Aquas that I had from the previous patch when I tested the Phalaris Aqua army. Because when they have combat turned off in the PAL monitor stand or in the radial menu as a party PAL, they will extinguish the burning PAL pods, and then Finsider Ignis, being this, either fire or water works, they're both, so it just works out very well. It's just very nice against this burning PAL pod type of thing. So here you can see, like, comparing it with Neptilius, what I meant that it hurt like the absolute burst phase. First, Trigger Happy doesn't work well with Absolute Frost, a bit of a downside, but that's not due to this patch, that's just the way it is. But you can see Neptilius, their first 3 skills, so in the first 30-second mark they will reach this ad phase. Finsider Ignis taking the full minute, they will have to use a second wave of attacks, but it does time very well with this like Meteor Rain. So maybe it's not that bad, but if you do add player damage to it, it's going to take a little bit faster. You're going to have those ads when Meteor Rain is ready at least, but still. Roughly 30 seconds longer to get to the first stun phase compared to something like Neptilius. And then a second downside here, when the fight does drag on a little bit longer, when you're using these pals, like, they tend to get incapacitated a little bit more often, need to get rescued a little bit more. DPS is just overall a little bit lower than when you're using something like Neptilius. they do get hungry, like the food starts to wear off. You could use like Musarina Cheeseburger. I usually save those for when I'm fruit farming, like Moonlord or Rio Ultra. But you can see that they get this hunger debuff. Some of them even start to starve instead, and they just like get that 20% reduction in defense and attack, and the fight takes even longer. But one fight where they were really shining, I would say, is this Moonlord Master fight. So just doing an example fight here with leaving the base. Notice how the PAL pods are set up. I feel like this is a pretty good setup against Moonlord Master. Just having the PAL pods sort of towards you here underneath the player, and having the pals being rescued away from that beam that slices the field. Using Dark Wisp, you can see it homes in on the eye, and then when the eye opens, it will hit all those. Then Trigger Happy, and I think Beam Slicer, just because it is a Lunker army, getting that bonus 20 damage isn't bad when you're using Trigger Happy and Beam Slicer. So just overall, a couple of things that are really going for this pal is just this, like being water, fire, like burn, immune. Really good with the pal pod strategy that is now back. Also really good just in terms of survivability. Burn damage does do a lot of damage. So if your pal has like a certain amount of health left after a meteor rain, it will just burn to death. Or there's a lot of skills that light your pals on fire. I think Moonlord is the only raid boss that doesn't have this burn effect. It just deals heavy damage. But you can sort of see Finsider Ignis' very small hitbox is kind of not being hit the same way. You can see these eyes going down here. They might hit once or twice compared to like 3 or 4 times against a bigger target. Even the beam that slices across the field, both the big eye and the smaller eyes are using these sort of beam attacks. The small hitbox from Finsider just seems to work. But one thing you might notice now that Palpods are back are the Finsider Ignis is kind of walking slowly to get in range of Moonlord. So you can see, like it's not displayed in-game, I do have it on the active stats page, or active skills page on the website. Just the minimum range of all the attacks. So some skills like Dark Wisp is really good at following, but the pals need to move like almost within, like standing almost just beneath the boss to reach. Stuff like Beam Slicer, Hydro Slicer can be used quite far away, Trigger Happy as well. So it's like, you will notice pals like Neptilius kind of go from the pal pod to be in range of Dark Wisp a lot faster. So it turns into quite a high DPS boost just being able to move closer. But Trigger Happy, on top of being this like really high DPS skill, seems to be decent against Moonlord. It was better last patch because again, all the damage is kind of focused, or at least 40% is focused into that last bullet. So if that misses, it does hurt. While previously, like as long as they were hitting some bullets, it would be fine. So it does hurt them quite a bit against Moonlord, but it's still a pretty quick fight. I did a quick comparison against my Neptilius army, but I don't want to say anything too soon with them, because I still haven't really optimized. Like, I feel like there's some optimization to do with where the pal pods are to get the pals within range. Maybe getting the pal pods a little bit closer would help these Fignesses, but they are like within 2 or 3 seconds of the fight timer for my Neptilius army as well. Just a little bit better bed setup maybe to boost them up there. So just overall, this Trigger Happy, Hydro Slicer and Dark Wisp. Maybe swapping Dark Wisp for like Beam Slicer to get the range problem sorted, but I feel like Dark Wisp is just super strong against Moonlord's hands, so it works out like it's probably the skill I will keep on using. So to summarize this, Finsider Ignis is still very strong. It does hurt a little bit mostly having this like stagger thing for the last bullet. So being staggered out of the last bullet is quite a heavy DPS loss now. Missing the last bullet against Moonlord also hurts quite a bit. But the upside is like against all the raids, it doesn't burn. It makes really good use of Lunker, getting that defense bonus, getting like bonus damage on Trigger Happy, Hydro Slicer, and Wall Splash must be mentioned, but Wall Splash does seem bugged right now, missing quite a lot. The small hitbox not taking a huge amount of damage, working well with pal pods. Just overall, all these things kind of make it a really good pal against the raid bosses. Now, like, in this video, I wasn't using pal pods against Rio and Libero because we kind of outscaled them, but you could use these pals like with way lower investment. And then against Libero, you can't really do the rescue thing because she breaks the beds really quickly. So you kind of have to find your own kind of sweet spot there, I guess, like the minimum amount required. Rio, it will work better, having like slightly weaker Finsider Ignises and then bringing some rescue pals instead. He doesn't really break the beds the same way. But against Libero, not getting frozen or stuff like I mentioned with Orsurk against Rio when it does change phase, they will just keep attacking really good. Against Ryu, they do super like burst damage in the first phase with Hydro Slice or Wall Splash if that gets fixed, Trigger Happy and Holy Burst, and then just resisting all those fire attacks in phase 1, and then being small as mentioned against electric skills in phase 2, they seem to not get stunned quite as much. Then Xenolord, this is probably the worst fight for them, at least Xenolord Ultra. Normal Xenolord is probably fine, but it's nice they can get Meteor Rain, and like being able to breed from Meteor Rain is pretty good compared to something like Neptilius. But at the same time, like having this low bulk where they get one shot and need to get rescued quite a lot does hurt them. Especially with that slow moving back speed, and just like one Meteor Rain and one Cosmic Meteor is usually enough to wipe out the entire army. So it does suffer a little bit from that. But overall, I mean, it works, especially if you do add player damage to it. You'll reach that for a stun phase. You can take care of the adds that Meteor Rain doesn't take care of. Just some stuff like that so they don't get staggered as much. Like all the Xenovaders and Xenoguards tend to really annoy them with the Trigger Happy, stunning them out of Trigger Happy with a little dashing skills and stuff. Then Moonlord, they just seem super good against Moonlord, in my opinion. Just being small, Trigger Happy being a good skill because it's always hard to choose like the best 3 skills. Seems to have a long minimum range as well, can get used from pretty far away. Does hurt, the change, it hurts quite a bit, and being slow getting back into the fight hurts it quite a bit. But still, I wouldn't say that Finsider Ignis is dead. Like these changes to the Palpods really just put a further emphasis on these fire or water pals. So maybe like Bastigor was the king of the previous patch, I would say. And now Bastigor is looking quite a lot worse. Same thing with Orsurk really. Like now it's harder to recommend those for at least like Xenolord Ultra. Moonlord doesn't really matter, doesn't put your beds on fire. And then Ryu and Libero, you don't really need the Palpods. But it's mostly like against that Xenolord Ultra, you do want these water fire pals, probably the best bet there. So Finsider Ignis still looking really good, just fitting this meta that we have right now with the Palpods and non-burning pals. So that's it for this video, thanks for watching.